What's up, my friends? How y'all doing today? My name's Carpo, for those who don't already know. And this afternoon I'm going to tackle a subject about, well, I guess it kind of ties in epigenetics, which would be, I don't even want to get into the scientific, technological aspect of it. I really want to keep it in the realm of discussion where all people can actually understand. There's far too much scientific jargon out there about, human nature. And we talk about genetics and what we're predisposed to certain diseases, okay? And we're also predisposed to certain mental disorders. We know that some people are predisposed to be, there's several different conditions you can have. The one that I'm particularly thinking of would be, like any type of multiple personality disorder or schizophrenia, which can be induced by certain substances. In other words, there's always been a discussion about how cannabis will make you psychotic, or it will make you, it won't actually trigger that, or I shouldn't say it won't actually create that, but rather trigger that in certain individuals who are predisposed. And it could be any variety of different things that trigger it. It could be a life change, an experience, something that happens to you. A very traumatic event can change the way a person thinks and make them, societally insane, I guess, technically. But what I'm trying to get at here is the difference is whether or not we as humans, really, I think we need to embrace our differences a lot more than we do. And the differences within, let's say, men and women is one thing. You have the men tend to have more. I can't remember. It was a few years ago. I watched this documentary where they did a bunch of studies on men and women to see how they viewed the world differently in physical attributes. Men tend to focus on larger land masses when they're traveling, let's say, and they tended to be better at directions. Now, I'm not doing a man-woman comparison here to say one's better or worse. That would be preposterous. But what they found out was that women tend to produce more oxytocin, let's say, when they're with their children. And this is why they have such a strong motherly bond. They'll do anything for their kids. Whereas there's a lot of deadbeat dads out there. Well, likewise, there's a lot of great loving dads who would do anything for their kids, and a lot of deadbeat moms out there. So there's no set, solid, men are this way, women are this way. But the differences that we do have, I think we should embrace as much as possible. And instead of fighting to be equals on every level, and I'm definitely, this is not about finances or anything like that. I mean, men and women should be treated equal by society, period. But as for our strengths and weaknesses, I feel like we're trying to homogenize men and women to think that we can both do everything each other does. Well, in some regards, this is true. And I'm using that as a comparison to all people in general. In other words, let's say a kid goes into a psychiatrist's office and he's got some problem and he's trying to talk it out, and then the psychiatrist tells him, well, this is what you need to do. Do this and this and this. And he has a set system that may work for a majority of people he's worked with, but it doesn't work for that particular individual because he doesn't understand the depth of the person's mind. And I don't mean that the person's too deep in a sense of intelligence, but rather we don't know what's really going on in a person's head. All we can get is what a person tells us or what they come across as. I'm sitting here speaking to the camera. A person may listen to this video and think that, oh, he's a pretty sane, together individual. Another person may hear something I say and think this guy's totally nuts. But generally, it's the consensus overall that matters, not what one person says or another person. So let's take all the people together that are talking about each other's and ideas and what's important and say, rather than me as an individual try to determine what's good and bad about people or what's beneficial and useless in society, that we ask ourselves, why do people do certain things? And maybe is that a better way? This kind of stemmed from a video I made yesterday about sociopaths and how they're between 1% and 2% of the population. And one of the articles I read said there's nothing we can do to stop it. It's been consistent throughout history. The question is, what can we do to recognize these individuals? And is there something about that condition of not having empathy which is beneficial in our society. So, to back up a second, when we, you know, I guess it depends on whether you believe in evolution or not, but I do. I believe in evolution. I understand convergent evolution and the different forms of evolution in the sense that I don't think that everything evolved by chance, but rather that it's following a particular blueprint or pattern. I won't go into the details of what I believe in that, but when we're born, we do have certain conditions and features about our minds that are different than others and are difficult to change. And by looking at the psychopathic tendencies, they have a certain genetic code, and they're predisposed to not feel empathy for other people. This is a big thing because we can see this in the way people act, so it's something that affects us. But this is something that a person is born with, okay? And the thought that I'm trying to convey here, which is taking too long, is that what other conditions do we have as individuals that are just as debilitating that we are born with? And perhaps we can't all change certain things about ourselves that we want to change. Let's say that you're a negative thinker and you want to change it and be a positive person. Now, I've been able to get myself to be a positive thinker, but I was always a pretty positive person. If I had been negative all my life before I started trying to see all the positive in things, then maybe it wouldn't work for me. Maybe my brain would be predisposed to, not have enough serotonin production, which is a giant cause of anxiety and depression, is not having enough serotonin. Whereas a lack of dopamine production can cause you lack of motivation. So sometimes it's an extraneous or external source which causes our problems, such as we're taking a substance. Let's say a person who is, a heroin addict, they're going to feel down during the times when they're not taking their drug of choice because their body is so used to that elation. And then there are not just substances that are considered drugs, but rather more benign substances that may be considered even herbs or foods or different medications which don't affect your brain directly, in which you don't sense them or feel them. They wouldn't be considered a buzz or a high, but they're affecting you in ways you don't understand. So, to eliminate the drug or the substance aspect that will change our brain chemistry, let's go back to when we were born and say, what kind of things are we born with that we really can't change? And this is a very deep discussion. I couldn't even really get into it because I don't know. Basically, I guess I'm proposing the question of, we as individuals all have different traits that some of them are beneficial and some of them not so much. But you'll notice a person who, to give a very general black and white example, a person who is a mathematician, let's say, who spent their whole life obsessed with math. And the one thing that they found about mathematicians, and this isn't always the case, but statistically, overall, very intense, deep mathematicians tend to be socially awkward in groups other than their own group of mathematicians. And this is not a bad thing. This is understandable. Their brain is working in a language of numbers, okay? And they have set themselves on that course. Conversing within language is a completely different thing. So, it's the same way as a person who has spent, 30 years in prison, let's say, and they get out, and they don't know how to live in the regular world anymore, because their brain is so used to prison living. Well, the same thing happens to a person who goes to prison after they've lived in the real world, and they have to adjust to that. The brain allows us to adapt to whatever situation we're in, which does alter brain chemistry, and it alters physical characteristics depending on if we're working hard or not working, and we're always changing. But there's that one part about us that is us, that conscious being that we call ourselves, okay? And it's a very difficult thing to express what consciousness is, because a lot of folks will say, well, yeah, it's just our awareness of ourselves. But they've proposed questions such as, what about the person who, there are people with extreme amnesia that forget everything the minute that they hear it. And there's one guy in particular in England, they've interviewed him several times over the years, but they'll be like, yeah, we're doing an interview with you for this TV show, and he'll be like, oh no, and they have to remind him like every 30 seconds to a minute. But this man's learned how to live his entire life without knowing anything about his past. But he's still him. You see what I mean? That personality still remains. So the question I guess I'm asking is, within that personality, are there certain characteristics that we cannot change about ourselves? And if so, how can we use our strengths to our benefit? One thing I never realized when I was younger is that I really like to talk and discuss things. I was always a talker type person. I'm outgoing. But it wasn't until I started YouTube. And then I asked myself, okay, now is this a temporary thing? Is this one of those, obsessions that we get? Because a lot of folks who become obsessive compulsive about things, you pick up a habit or a book or something and you get really into it for a while, and then you move on to something else. That's the kind of person that I tend to be when it comes to doing things. Like if I get really into maybe making paper or, whatever it might be, there's very few things that really endure, and one of those is my conversational desire to talk with people. And so I'm starting to realize, okay, that's one of the parts of my personality. It's not something that I'm learning or doing out of discomfort. A lot of people talk when they feel uncomfortable in groups. But I'm talking to a camera, and it's something that I enjoy. So I know that that's part of my personality. And so I'm going to say, okay, it's consistent. So how do I utilize that? Whereas some of the strengths that I find in life are, and that could be considered a weakness as well. The fact that a person, talks a lot. And it's just like any tool, it's about utilizing it, making the best of it. And I think we all have strengths that we can utilize, but it's a crazy world, man. And it's a crazy life. Just being people. It's nuts. I mean, it really is. I mean, we sit and talk and have these conversations and whatnot, and our brains naturally forget about the holy shit aspect of living. Because it's like they said, a man's eyes can see everything except for themselves. And that's very true in the sense that we can never really know who we are by the feedback other people give us all the time, but usually that gives us a good idea of how others see us. But we can easily get wrapped up in our own way of thinking and wander off thinking everybody else is delusional. And some people do that. One of my biggest, the thing that I try to portray the most or carry on in my life the most is tolerance. To understand why people think the way they do without saying, you're a fucking idiot. Even though sometimes I want to. But I know that when a large majority of people believe a certain thing or think a certain way, it's worth analyzing instead of casting out. Because individuals who cast everyone out and say, screw you, I'm doing things my way, that's basically like a dictatorship. And we know how countries like that end up. And I'm not saying country-wise or leader-wise at all. I'm just talking about people in general. You might be that way as a boss in the workplace, or a person who's very confrontational and arrogant and boastful and harsh in your family life with your wife or with your kids. And so we as a society kind of as a whole decide which of these things are strengths and which are weaknesses. And also, how much are we willing to tolerate? Is it okay that we fight? Let's say there's no black and white. If somebody's trying to beat you up, you have the right to defend yourself. Oh, is murder right? No, of course not. But if you're trying to defend yourself, is it okay? Sure. Everything's black and white. And so is the way that we think. And it's okay to realize that sometimes we do things for reasons we don't understand. Because we can get called out at least on a lot of it when we find out. When I was a kid, I didn't know who I was, but I thought I did. We all do, right? And I was at the store today and I was thinking about, I was out eating lunch with my kids actually, and I started thinking about when I was younger, and I don't remember what made me think about it, but I started thinking about acne. I remember, Menthol Kratom made a video the other day where he talked about when he had acne as a kid, and he was being apologetic for it, like, sorry, I'm just talking about, zits, but I totally get it, because that could have, you could talk for hours about that, and people would understand if they've been there. When I was in school, I had really bad acne, and I always had the big, what we call the mounders, and I know what reminded me of this. I was walking home with my kid, and I asked him if he wanted some chapstick, and he said, what's chapstick? And I said, well, it's for when your lips get chapped, and I told him about it in school. I used to have really bad chapped lips. I had a nervous habit of licking my lips, and they would be completely red with a line of, like, where it got seriously chapped above the lip. That combined with everybody teasing me saying, oh, big nose or acne or whatever it might be, I basically felt like, I didn't hate myself, but I basically had this screw everybody else type attitude towards those people. But I pretty much ignored it, you know. I got through. I was fine. It's not like I was constantly bombarded and picked on. But my friends were the ones that called me Lipstick Man because of the chapped lips. And I'm thinking back to that and how I hadn't even remembered that until today. It's been so many years. And we joke about it now, but you know, you think about back in school and the types of things that you endure. We're all picked on one way or another, you know. There's always a hierarchy of people within the school that are, you know, making others feel bad because they're lesser, and we know deep inside that, you know, it's just childish antics, usually carried on by our changing hormones and whatnot. But during that time of being a teenager, you learn a lot about the world, but you don't really get to know yourself yet. And as you grow, you know, and you age, and then you get off into the world and working, doing whatever, getting a family together. And then at a point you sit back and look at it all and say, okay, life is short, but it's pretty damn long. What am I really going to do with it? And you start to look at the things that you've done with your life, and the things that have benefited you, and you try to share that with other people in hopes that everyone can gain a little bit from each other. And then we could all learn to live a little better by admitting our faults first. Because if you're willing to admit your faults, then you take away the ammunition of other people to attack you. But more than that, you give other people inspiration to let them know that they can show their faults too. If we expose our weaknesses to one another, then it lets us really understand who we are instead of who we just wish we were, or who we're pretending to be, you know? I'm as real as I can be, you know, like making these videos, it's, you know, this is how I talk. It's not like I'm, you know, putting on a persona, but at the same time, you know, I'm only looking at it from my aspect of it, you know. I'm sure there's a certain amount of, I don't know, a certain amount of just things we don't understand about ourselves, that by talking with others and not being too defensive, we can learn how those things work. So, yeah. I guess that's about all I got. I could ramble on about this, but I kind of got off subject about the brain chemistry because there's not a lot I can say about it. But rather, I just wanted to say that there's certain aspects about people that we can't expect to change. You can't just throw a person into a class or tell them, hey, you have to learn how to be this way, or all you have to do is meditate, or all you have to do is this, or learn that. It just doesn't work for all people. So we embrace the differences, and we utilize those differences. You know, if you've got a group of strong people, physically strong, then they can do the labor. If you've got people who are mentally strong, then they can do the mental lifting and do the paperwork and build a house together. You know, that's the thing. It's not about trying to prove that everybody should be able to do everything. It's about utilizing all the strengths together and realizing that we're all just people. And one day we'll all just be laying on our deathbed wondering, what the hell? Did I do that right? Hopefully. Talk to y'all later. Have a wonderful